Uh, hey, Ambrose.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah, you sound
Good
good.
morning. Good to see
Good
you.
morning. Thanks. Good to see you
Yeah,
guys too.
yeah. Thanks
Yeah.
for coming on. We're excited.
Sure.
We've been talking about all sorts of different things as we were waiting and just kind of going through. And I just want to say thank you, for coming on, and thank you for the work that you've done with your book. Angels, alien. Nope. Let's see. I always screw it. Angels, Archons, and aliens. Um,
Yeah.
It's just such a, I love the book. I loved it. It was such a fun book to read. It was very well done. I thought very thoroughly researched. I think you have over 1,000 footnotes. But it's not purely academic. It's easy to read. And it just provoked so many different so much, I guess, wonder in me as I was reading through it. And I just think it's complete with declassified top secret memos from top ranking military and other officials, and pictures of officials and drawings and artwork, and a thorough analysis of various facets of the different ancient texts, and including the Old and New Testaments. And I even love the aesthetics of the typeset and stuff like that. And it's just one of my favorite books that I've read in a long time. No matter what we do with this subject, and no matter where we come out on it, I'm not sure that Paul and I have drawn any sort of hard and fast,
Yeah.
conclusions. But nonetheless, I think that your work is just well done, and I would just heartily recommend it to any of our listeners, just if they want to learn more about ufology and the different stories and things like that, which are, there's just so many entertaining, if for no other reason, like I just found it a thoroughly entertaining work. So the way I discovered you was through your work on Origin of Alexandria, which you've done a lot of writing on Origin. And I think many of us pretty much just consider you an authority to one degree or another on Origin of Alexandria, whom I also share an affinity with, and so does Paul. And we're deeply appreciative of his work. And so the first question we have for you is, what do you love about Origin? And how did he influence you both theologically and maybe even when it comes to the topics that you are going through in your book?
Yeah. Um, since your listeners might not know who I am or anything like that, I'll kind of begin with an overview of my Christian experience thus far. Um, I was born in New York and raised Christian from birth. And throughout my life, I personally experienced 10 different denominations throughout 3 different states, which include like the Pentecostal Assemblies of God, a full preterist Independent Bible Baptist Church, Calvary Chapel, Fire Church, which is charismatic, Brethren in Christ, Fundamentalists, King James Only Bible Baptist, Sovereign Grace, Presbyterian Church of America, Liberty Church, which is like a local Presbyterian kind of methodology in the Philadelphia area. And then now Eastern Orthodox, OCA. I've been intensely studying the Bible for, I would say, my entire adult life, wanting to learn everything I could about the text, literally listening to sermons for 8 hours a day. It was an obsession. This desire to breathe the scriptures is kind of what low church Protestantism, as you know, instills in their people, for better or for worse. I mean, I wish some people would probably put down the Bible and pick up a history book, um, but my spiritual journey is I would say only one example of where that philosophy of Bible might lead. But about Origin, knowing this background of mine, I was always taught what I would call a kind of like the low IQ, like Wikipedia version of Origin, right? Which is like the basic narrative that Origin was some arch heretic that screwed everything up. Nobody ever liked him.
Right.
Allegory bad. universalism would send you to hell,
Right.
and not to mention he cut off his pee-pee, you know.
Right. Supposedly.
What a weirdo, right?
Yeah.
I bought into all that
Mhm.
before I actually read him, and his spiritual descendants like Gregor of Nyssa and all that. And I looked into the sources people would use to support this stuff, like Jerome, Epiphanius, Eusebius, and I realized it was kind of a gigantic mess, and that something tragic had occurred here. One of the first things from Origen I remember reading was his interpretation of the Witch of Endor episode, and whether it was truly Samuel or a demon pretending to be Samuel. And what Origen said was, and I'm not making this up, this was what he said was identical to my own rationale when I read the text for the first time when I was like 19. And the more I read Origen, the more I personally related to the way that he thought about the text. And he very quickly became my primary teacher, who showed me how to channel the intellect and reason into the text as a guardrail, preventing people from getting wrong ideas about the divine. I love his many edifying insights and pastoral heart. I started devouring his writings to such an extent that I ended up being in a position where I could begin writing my own mystical commentaries on the Bible in an Origenian fashion. And years ago, I don't know if you read this essay of mine, but I wrote a 30-page tutorial on how to do it for the benefit of clergy. And it's pretty obvious that this is probably what happened to Origenians like Gregory of Nyssa. The thing that struck me the most in my Origen studies is the extent to which Origen is embedded into the fabric of historical Christian development. And I think even historical scholars don't understand the extent of this, because they're not themselves very educated on Origen's primary source material and his followers. For instance, it was paradigm shifting to see that not only did Athanasius, for instance, call Origen a church father and see him as a source of authority against Arianism in De Depretis 627, but these theologians did not have a flat view of Scripture, contrary to my evangelical upbringing. If evangelicals knew what the most influential Christians believed about the Old Testament in the 4th century, they would think it was probably like scandalous Marcionite heresy or something. For example, I mentioned this in the book, Gregory of Nyssa in Life of Moses 291 to 92 says that a literal reading of the Exodus narrative is essentially irrational, incoherent, and makes God evil.
Yeah.
And that's why we should allegorize it instead with a kind of internalized introspective mysticism, where slaughtering children becomes transformed into slaughtering the beginnings of sin in the heart and all that.
Yeah, very cool.
And it's not just Nyssa doing this. Allegorizing away the obvious evils of the Old Testament was standard practice for Christian scholars of antiquity. And this is made most clear in Origen, when he says in Homilies on Joshua 15:1, where he says, quote, "Unless those physical wars bore the figure of spiritual wars, I do not think the books of Jewish history would have ever been handed down by the apostles to the disciples of Christ who came to teach peace so that they could be read in churches," unquote. Now, this is radical stuff. And this was paradigm shifting for me. And remember, Origen represented the foremost anti-Marcionite position. And he was the one suggesting that a flat view of Scripture would basically turn God into Satan.
That's right.
I mostly blame John Calvin for derailing all of this.
We mostly blame John Calvin for everything, so don't worry.
I might be a little biased, but yeah. So, and Calvin did explicitly name Origen in his commentary on Galatians 4:22 to be kind of an existential, to be kind of like an exegetical antagonist to allegory.
Didn't Martin Luther say something too, like there's not a word about Jesus Christ in all of Origin, or some silly thing like that?
Yeah. Yeah, Erasmus vehemently disagreed with that.
Yeah. He say something like there's more truth in one page of Origin than in 10 page of Augustine, or something like that. Yeah.
But speaking of Originians, I know you guys just recently interviewed Jordan Wood, and I don't think I've ever met anyone else who so closely parallels my own life journey when it comes to like beginning in low church fundamentalism and the literalist tradition, and then like ending up being taught by Origen and being convinced of like universalist eschatology. And yeah, so I feel like a kind of parallel journey with Jordan, a kind of kinship there.
Yeah, very cool. So obviously he's influenced your understanding of Christianity, of how to read the scriptures, of just how to think, and he's done the same for me. I think he's done the same for Paul and for many of us, and certainly of the entire Christian tradition is just built upon the foundation of Didymus the Blind called Origen the 13th apostle. So but in terms of your book, so coming out of this background, working with Origen, and then you come out with this, sort of, I'm sure some people would think it's really weird or whatever. It's definitely kind of out there in some ways or whatever. What got you into UFOs after researching and working with Origen?
Yeah. It may sound strange to hear somebody pivoted from Origin studies to UFO studies. But of course, for those such as yourselves who actually read Origin, it's not much of a stretch after all. Few contemplated the notion of many worlds and the true nature of the lights in the night sky more than Origin. As you know, I opened the book with a quote from Montfort's Principles. It's also worth mentioning that the Greek title of that text is Archon, which is, if translated faithfully straight from the Greek rather than the Latin translation, it's perhaps more accurately translated as On the Archons. And a title which coincidentally also applies to my book.
Yeah.
So to echo a line from Dr. Diana Pasulka's book, American Cosmic, the study of religion can get pretty weird.
No doubt.
And so I embrace the weird stuff, which Charles Fort described as the quote unquote damned data, the data that society damns to the sideline now, as a necessary component for correctly understanding our reality. But anyway, studying biblical scholarship led me to studying the inherently related Mesopotamian scholarship, and such as the work of Thorkild Jakobsen, Wilfrid Lambert, Heinrich Zimmern, Stefan Nowicki, John Day, Mark Smith, Stephanie Daly, Michael Heiser, and so on. The information I gathered from these authors essentially became chapter 6 of my book. And it was during my study of ancient Mesopotamia when I discovered Zecharia Sitchin, who wrote a bunch of books I haven't read. But I discovered the general concept of the ancient astronaut hypothesis by reading about him. And so contrary to how most people seem to react, I took this proposal as a serious consideration and thought that whatever the truth may be, we have a deeply existential need to know if this hypothesis is probable or not. Since we can't come close to proof regarding prehistory, we must deal with probability, and simply laughing at the weird hair guy from Ancient Aliens isn't going to cut it. You know, the fact is, more and more people are becoming convinced by this explanation, and we should try to find out why, and whether it's popular Christian thought that has some things wrong. And my book goes into this quite extensively, as you know.
Yeah, I have, when I say when you mention your book, I have to admit I've read parts of it. I have not gotten through the whole thing, Ambrose, but
Sure.
and so for those of us who are slightly uninitiated, can you give us the broad layout of the how you structured the book and where you're going with it?
Sure. After a long preface and an introduction, the first chapter is titled Refuting Debunkers, which is where I go through over 20 common arguments people use to dismiss the subject and not take it seriously. I knew I had to kind of get that out of the way right at the beginning, or else readers might convince themselves that there's no reason to read the rest of the book.
And when we say debunkers, these would be people that are simply denying that there is the evidence for aliens or for UFOs. So they're debunking they're just the whole concept entirely.
Right. So I would probably make a distinction between debunkers and skeptics. A skeptic is somebody who, doesn't want to make up their mind right away and wants to investigate further and all this. A debunker is more like somebody who is trying to convince themselves that something isn't real. And so these people kind of come up with the most ridiculous explanations that don't account for any of the data, just to kind of come up with some prosaic explanation of something. And so and it just comes across as disingenuous and all of that. So I go through a lot of the common arguments that they use for that.
And I guess the part of this that and I think you bring this out is that where at one time this was kind of a subject that wouldn't have even been brought up in mainstream media, but now we actually have a official government spokesman coming out and saying, well, there's something here. So I guess the point being, whatever this is, it's no longer just out of bounds for even mainstream understanding, or even for apparently the United States government.
Yeah. Yep. So that's what chapter 1 is dedicated to. And then the second chapter is extraterrestrial evidence. So that's when I go through like a historical survey of aerial phenomena going back thousands of years. The third chapter is institutional myth makers, which explains why there was a global cover-up of the subject led by the United States, the national security state, which I refer to as the narrative security state. Chapter 4 is Christian history, where I explain the deep history of what was considered scandalous speculation of certain forward-thinking Christian theologians. I also go over the bizarre details found in the New Testament and Christian, mostly monastic, hagiographical accounts of aerial phenomena up until the present day. And then chapter 5 is Hebrew conceptions, which is an analysis of aerial phenomena found in the Old Testament. Chapter 6 is Mesopotamian ancestry, which I kind of alluded to earlier, which is a comparative analysis of the Hebrew Bible and Mesopotamian religions. Chapter 7 is what I call esoteric history, which presents some of the assertions about possible extraterrestrial origins of mankind on the planet and the possibility of subterranean civilizations. Chapter 8 is exometaphysics, which gets into Nikola Tesla's wingless flying machine at the turn of the century, and then Dr. John von Neumann's classified work for the U.S. Navy, known as Project Rainbow, the science of telepathy, portals, time travel. That chapter, I just get into everything with that. Chapter 9 is parapsychological connections, which gets into astral projection, remote viewing, psychedelics, near-death experiences, and reincarnation. Chapter 10 is the hypostases of Archons, which is about the reported extraterrestrial phenotypes, so the different types of aliens that get reported as being encountered. Chapter 11 is extraterrestrial Jesus, which is all about exochristology. That is what alleged extraterrestrial contacts claim about the person of Jesus Christ. And the final chapter is Dark Horizon, where I kind of critically analyze all of the major Christian interpretations of the UFO phenomenon thus far from a variety of denominations, and show why all of them can kind of be reduced to inadequate apologetics meant to maintain some received status quo. And I end with a speculative look into the, shall we say, Aquarian future of the Christian religion.
And by Aquarian, can you define that?
So in like a lot of like New Age circles, they kind of refer to the age of Aquarius, which is kind of like the next epoch of human civilization, and it's going to be like a kind of a shift in human development or something. But it's kind of just like a shorthand to refer to the next future age of mankind.
And is it an exploration of that or an advocation of that?
That part is really just like a speculative look into where Christianity could be headed in the future, just in the future, like when certain things become more normal, with just like a global mindset, a globally united planet. Because I mentioned how Christianity, just as a religion, wasn't really ever intended to stay in Jerusalem, right? It's like a globally minded faith. And so it's like we're at this point of like, where is the Christian religion going from here? What's the end game, right? And so that's kind of like what I just kind of lay out in the last chapter.
Okay, yeah. I get my introduction to UFOs is not very exalting in that as a young man, I actually met a man who built UFOs.
Oh yeah? Who?
He was a man Banning in Phoenix, Arizona. He had a wide assortment of UFOs and just enjoyed the publicity that he could generate from his various machines. Some of them were pretty crude. He actually built gyrocopters and sold gyrocopters, but then from the gyrocopters was able to fashion all sorts of, one was a very crude and kind of saucer looking one. The others that actually got a lot of publicity were actually balloons that were shaped like UFOs. And he had newspaper stories. I remember one particularly over Tucumcari, New Mexico, in which he flew his balloon. And I think it was, it had nothing to do, but the power happened to go out in a portion of the city. And of course, the newspaper stories make the immediate connection. He wanted me to come along and cite his UFOs and report it. I never did it. But he just had a good time with it. And so with that, and obviously that doesn't account for a lot of the sorts of things that you're describing. But I think that one has to acknowledge that there has been a lot of deception in the area, and a leaping to an understanding. And so I guess my question for you is, you've clearly been convinced, and I'm wondering what has been most convincing. What is the thing that has been the convincing evidence for you?
Yeah. Can I just jump in just super quick, just to kind of temper? So that was Paul's introduction, to this. Mine was a little bit different. It was a lot different. So I'm going to kind of go out on a limb and tell this story. But it was about the summer of 1996. I was sitting on my dad's porch. It was in Steubenville, Ohio, on Lincoln Heights is the neighborhood. It was a very beautiful blue, no clouds in the sky type day. And I was just sort of sitting there and just kind of maybe daydreaming or whatever. And all of a sudden I saw something very high up in the air. And it was just sort of hovering there. And I thought, what's that? It didn't look like a plane. It didn't look like this is before, they probably had military drones and things like this back in 96. I'm not sure about that, but it wasn't anything that I had ever seen. It was very high. So, and it kind of looked, it was grayish, and it looked strangely sort of aerodynamic, but not in like the way that we make things look aerodynamic. Yeah, that was what I was thinking in that moment. I was just kind of thinking, what is this? And it was, I can still picture it. It was there. And then all of a sudden, whatever this was, it shot off and traversed the entire sky within, I would say, maybe a second. I would no more than 2 seconds, but probably more like a second. But it went from standing still to just completely shooting off, over the sky. It didn't make any sound. It didn't have any sort of propulsion that I could see. There was no plume. And it was the most shocking thing that I had ever seen, like in the skies, and I was just left wondering, like, what on earth was that, and it was one of those situations where I didn't really want to tell anybody, because for the same reasons that I'm sure many people don't want to talk about it. I didn't, think that people would believe me. I thought people, if they did, they would just make fun of me or think that I was high or crazy or just whatever. But I was sober as a judge, and once you see something like that, you can't unsee it. And so again, I'm open. It's like, I don't know if it was some sort of terrestrial or military thing or whatever it was, but I can tell you this, it was like nothing I had ever seen in my life. And the speed was the shocking thing, the way that it went from standing still to just full speed, traversing the whole sky without any type of sound. At first I thought it was a bug or something in my eye, like, something gets stuck in your eye and you kind of say, is there something in my vision? And I kind of like wipe my eyes just to make sure, but there was nothing like hurting my eye. And so it wasn't that, and I looked and I saw it, and it was just as fast as I could see it. It was gone. It was an amazing thing. So that's a very different kind of introduction than, what Paul was describing, where some guy is like trying to, sort of make money and, cause trouble, a hoaxer. Yeah. And so like that really, when you see something like that, even if you can't make sense of it, you can't unsee it, and it's like there's something that happens in you, or at least for me, where that provoked a lifelong sort of like fascination with what in the world was that, so whenever you read someone's book like yours and you see that there's like thousands of people who have had similar experiences or whatever, it kind of makes you feel a little bit better. you know, and I go from the point of not wanting to tell anybody back in 1996 to saying it on a podcast. You know what I mean? Because
Right.
it's so sort of commonplace for these types of things. And it's like, again, I'm not saying it was aliens or whatever. I'm just saying I saw what I saw, and it was some phenomenon that I've never seen since, and was amazing. But you know, back to Paul's question of
I should say about Bannock's stuff. If you saw his UFO, you wouldn't mistake it for what you just described. The saucer, it was actually, he couldn't manipulate it very well. He could kind of go up and down. The balloons, actually, he got a lot more media coverage with his balloons. I think because, you know, you couldn't quite tell what they were up in the air. His goal, actually, I don't think he ever did it. He was a pretty old man when I met him. This is back in, this would have been in the 1970s that I first met him. His goal was he was going to build a light airplane, and he wanted to fly it across the United States upside down. He was just a guy that he had a good time with his hobby. I don't think there was anything vicious or cruel in what he was doing, but just the kind of playing on people's gullibility.
Yeah, so I would say, I mean, hoaxers are obviously real. They take advantage of the buzz, but yeah, like you can't hoax a UFO that stays still and then shoots off like a bullet from a rifle in the sky. You can't make a balloon that does that. So like the actual motions are very important for UFO sightings. But the evidence that I found most convincing was like kind of like what Matt was saying, that there's no end to the number of testimony, documentation, credible witnesses to the phenomenon, even down to aerial abductions. But well, like once you read your, 487th person saying the same things that others have said, you just kind of stop pretending like there's nothing to it. But I'm also someone who's very well read in ancient Christian literature, such as the sayings of the Desert Fathers, and how Athanasius mentions in chapter 11 of the life of St. Anthony about how the young Anthony of Egypt, probably around the year 270 AD, encountered a quote unquote large silver disc parked in the remote Egyptian desert and was big enough to be blocking his route. So I suppose I had a bit of a head start with this stuff because it's always been there in the religious literature and that I've been reading for years. And the historical element to it is, to me, probably the most convincing aspect of it, because that shows that it's not a modern phenomenon that could be entirely explained by hoaxers, so that gives it a kind of historical continuity. So that would be my, like, what's most convincing for me.
What else though? I mean, that can't be the only, I mean, that was convincing to me too, by the way, reading through your book. And again, I would just encourage anybody listening, if you just want to learn more about this topic and kind of see, because Ambrose is so thorough at kind of laying out, I mean, it's like 828 pages or something like that. So it's something that, it's a book that I plan on just going back to again and again, just to read the story. I mean, they're just great stories. It's full of all sorts of really cool, fascinating stuff, but the historical part was that was really important to me too, because I've read the sayings of the Desert Fathers, of course, and the life of Anthony and all these different things. I didn't, when you're not reading it, in the way that you just described, you're not thinking like, oh, that was a UFO that Anthony saw. Right. You're just, you don't kind of make that connection. But once you see it, you can't unsee it, right? And so what else, as you were going through, was like something that kind of was such a strong evidence for you to, I mean, you decided to write a book on this, man. Like you went from doing theological studies and devoting your life to that to, I guess, devoting the last few years of your life or whatever to this. And it's clearly from your book, it's been an enormous labor, I would say, of love. And what the other thing that struck me is that, you know, you're writing this to Christians. You make that very clear at the beginning. You know, you say that this is a sort of a challenge to Christianity and from your perspective in some ways. And not only that, but to the treatment of the people who have come forward, you know, and have been sort of shunned by their churches or made fun of or called liars. And it's like, well, this is what Paul and I were talking about before you came on. It's like, well, if you have 1,000 people sitting in front of you, and some of them are like Betty Andreessen, who's just making food in her kitchen or whatever, and then see something, and you know, she's a Christian woman, whatever, you have all these different people. Are you just going to keep calling them a liar, like one after another, like you're a liar, you're a liar, you're a liar? And it's like, I think that I felt your heart coming through that, because it's like, you know, Christianity stands or falls upon witness testimony.
Right.
You say that in your book, you know? And so that to me was a way to frame it, to go, well, yeah, I've probably done that to a degree too, where I've been like, man, these people are, you know, some of them are like, there are, just like you point out in your book, that, you know, are there, the one thing that you can say about people is like, oh, well, they're just schizophrenic, or oh, they're just delusional, or they're hoaxers or whatever. But of course, you can say the same exact thing about the Christian churches throughout the world. You can say that there's been schizophrenics and hoaxers and liars and, you know, people just trying to make money or whatever else. So that was actually like a pretty kind of cool and convincing way to frame the discussion, I thought. It kind of helps you look at it with more of a charitable, you know, perspective. But what I guess kind of struck me is you clearly love the Christian tradition, theology, things like that. So for you to write a book like this and to kind of put yourself out there, you know, in a way where, you know, you could be the object and probably will be the object of scorn or dismissal or shunning, or Christian friends, you know, sort of saying, oh, Ambrose has just gone off. He's finally gone off the deep end, you know? And they could say the same thing about us for having this podcast of like, oh, they finally gone off the deep end over there forging Ploughshares. They're talking about UFOs and blah, 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 you know? And it's like, I get that. But for me, it's like, you have to respect the work. I mean, I read, you know, it's like, I read a lot of this stuff. And so when I read your book, I was like, well, whatever we're going to do with this, like, you got to respect the work, man. I mean, it's whether you, and I was likening it before you came on to like Oliver Stone when he did JFK. You know, he kind of threw everything against the wall, right? And to see what sticks. And it's like, well, as a viewer of that movie, you're kind of left with kind of like your own decision to make. It's like, clearly Oliver Stone thinks that there was some sort of conspiracy, that the CIA, which was about to be abolished by Kennedy, you know, they killed him, right? And then he kind of just throws all this stuff against the wall and says, okay, you just need to decide. But it seems like there's something to it, right? It's like when you watch JFK, you're like, boy,
they put Alan Dulles on the Warren Commission.
Yeah, they put Wallen Dulles. Yeah. They put Wallen Dulles.
What a stupid decision was that?
I mean, it's crazy, right? So in other words, like, and I'm going to let you answer the question, but to me, when it came to like the convincing evidence or whatever, it's kind of like that JFK type scenario where it's like you read this giant book and you go, man, there's all kind of declassified, top secret, you know, documents that are right here, and they're by like admirals of the South Seas of, you know, the Pacific, and it's like, these aren't just like some you know, private running around. I mean, these are like top people in the government, in the military, in writing, talking about some of this stuff. And so when you couple the history that you were just talking about in the literature with you know, the eyewitness accounts, with the declassified documentation, you know, et cetera, and you just kind of keep piling it on, much like Oliver Stone and JFK, it's kind of like the viewer or the listener or the reader or whatever is left with it's a clear decision almost, that you got it, like that there's at least something to this. That's how I came away with it.
Yeah, like after seeing, and that's why kind of like the book is so big. Like part of the reason is because I wanted the quantity to be an element of the persuasion. So like when you read through like hundreds and hundreds of pages, what are you going to say? It's all fake.
Yeah, I mean, the Commander David Fravor, I would say that for me, that was like definitely one of the most convincing. Like, you can maybe tell the quick story of Commander David Fravor, but anybody who wants to listen, he had a very, famous interview with Joe Rogan on the Joe Rogan Experience. He had another interview. I forget the guy's name. You probably remember, where he goes on, and I mean, this guy has impeccable credentials. He was a Top Gun pilot, and he was the leader of a squadron. You know what I mean? He was like, this guy struck me as someone who has integrity and who knows what he's talking about, and is talking about physics and engineering, and he has all this experience flying, for the United States Navy as a Top Gun pilot, and he just seems like no nonsense or whatever. He has nothing to gain and everything to lose by telling this story. We have the radar data and stuff like that. It's the famous Tic Tac video that everyone can see, and it's like, when you listen to someone like that, I mean, what am I going to say? Like, you're a liar? It's like, that doesn't seem right to me.
Right. Yeah. And that's like, that's kind of the point I wanted to make clear in the book, is that at some point, if you're continuing to deny witness testimony, you're essentially eroding your own faith, because like we mentioned already, that the Christian faith is founded on witness testimony. Like, Christianity wouldn't exist without it. So it's just kind of my approach. Like, I don't want to ever be guilty of double standards. That's just my own, like, I think everyone should be that way, but not everyone is. But that's my own, like, heart, is I don't want to give a wrongly placed criticism to something that I'm also guilty of, right? So so my own understanding of my faith was central to my investigation of this, like with these witness testimonies and stuff. But yeah, Commander David Fravor, he was the commanding pilot of the 2004 incident, which I kind of like briefly mention it in the book just because of how frequently it has been talked about since 2017. That's like all anyone ever talks about is this incident. So I kind of just like, all right, I'm not gonna give too much time to that. But yeah, like, I think it was on, what was it, the Weaponized podcast, one of the episodes where one of the Navy guys said that David Fravor is essentially the closest thing to the Tom Cruise character in Top Gun in the United States. It doesn't really get more credentialed than that. And then you also have like Ryan Graves and Alex Dietrich, some of the other pilots that were involved in that incident. But yeah, I'm with you. Like, there's too many credible witnesses to this.
It is the Lex Friedman podcast that Commander David Fravor also appeared on, where he goes, it's like a 2.5 hour interview. And again, I guess there just comes a point for me that it's like, well, I don't know. I mean, he himself is saying, it's not like it's just us saying, what is this? It's the Pentagon. It's the people in charge who are going, yeah, we've determined that it doesn't belong to an enemy state. It doesn't have any of the characteristics of anything that we know to exist, the way that it moves, the speed at which it moves, all this different stuff. And it's like, well, who am I to tell Commander David Fravor that, like, you're full of crap or whatever? Like, it just seems kind of silly in some way. And that would be one thing if it was just one guy. Maybe you could say, oh, that's silly, whatever. But whenever you have a bunch of Commander David Fravor types, coupled with all the other evidence that you're setting forth, the reader can't help but to think, maybe there's something to this. And again, we might not be, drawing any definitive conclusions and saying that, making some of the leaps, even maybe that you're willing to make, but the reader nonetheless is left with such, it's like, reading the Bible or something, right? It's like you come away with it and you're like, is there something to this or not?
Mm-hmm.
You know, part of this, and this is kind of a side note. This seems to have come into popular imagination that is a bit surprising to me. I lived in Roswell, New Mexico, on the Air Force base that was closed, and they moved the base. As a high school student, we lived there on the base. It was no longer, you know, it was just there was an airport there, and I've never heard of any of this. You know, I lived in the very place.
What year?
That was in the 1970s. Yeah,
the 70s.
Yeah. So it's kind of surprising to me. Now everybody talks about Roswell. Well, wait a minute. I lived there.
Yeah.
In fact, I lived on the very site, and I never heard this. And so it's kind of interesting that this has come to people's attention, where for at least, you know, I don't know that I was any more oblivious than anyone else, but no one was talking about that when I was in Roswell.
Yeah. By the 70s, that would have been the case. The military really had that subject on lockdown by then, especially after, because 1969 was when the Condon report kind of concluded there was nothing to this, and that I go over in the book that was just a complete like CIA driven fiasco. But that essentially ended the conversation as far as the public's concerned. There was maybe one or two organizations that were still active. NICAP, which was kind of one of the earliest. Donald Kehoe was a Marine Corps major that kind of was one of the early advocates for the UFO subject. He kind of began NICAP and all that, but that was by the 70s. NICAP was falling out of favor, and APRO was really the last bastion of like UFO studies. And it wasn't real. The common narrative is that it wasn't really until 1980 when Bill Moore published kind of like the first definitive Roswell book, and that's kind of what brought Roswell back into like public consciousness. But yeah, like Roswell, right from the start, it was like crash happens, an article comes out saying that the military got a flying saucer, a saucer-shaped craft. They immediately, like within a day, retract the article and cover it up, and then yeah, it just goes from there. But people, I think I should mention that people need to understand that the government is not one thing, right? Like back in 1947, it was Roswell Army Airfield, and they were the first kind of they were the only ones with like nuclear weaponry at the time in the world, really. And that was like June, July 1947, and then September of that year is when everything changes with the National Security Act, and then that's when the CIA is created and the entire restructuring of the military. But right from the beginning, like since the early 50s, you have factions in the government. So it's not like, you know, everyone, like the Air Force, the CIA, the Army, everyone's united on the UFO subject. It's like there are factions within the military of some people who want to cover it up and other people who want to disclose it. And that's been the case since the beginning, and it's still true today. So this is what I think people don't get when they are trying to figure out like why now, you know, why is there seem to be a shift in the conversation and all this. Well, a lot of the old guard died. A lot of like the people who kind of were in charge of the cover up and all of like the kind of first wave empire group, you could say, the people trying to maintain status quo, they died off. So there's like new people in in these positions, and the kind of dynamics are shifting a bit. And so you have people now like Christopher Mellon, Luis Elizondo, and like a lot of these public figures that are being interviewed now. They're kind of trying to overcome the what I call the Empire group, people who are trying to like cover it up still. I would put like Bobby Ray Inman in that category of that group. But so this is still a fight. It's still a back and forth. Some people want this out, some people don't, and so that's something that I think people should really understand, that it's not, the government is not one thing with one opinion.
Yeah,
It's kind of like the church fathers, right? It's like where we imagine the church fathers, like the holy fathers, are this monolithic thing.
Yeah.
It's like, no, they were all saying all sorts of different things. And it's not like, based upon the research in your book, it's like, well, it could be that the Department of Defense knows things that they're not sharing with the other agencies and vice versa. And they all seem to kind of have their little groups where they're all, they're not really, that's part of the problem. And even some of the legislation, seems like they're just trying to be pushed for now, is that there's a sharing of information and stuff like that, because that precisely has not been happening.
Yeah. Overclassified.
It's
so overclassified that there are people in one agency with completely different interpretations. Like you'll have one person even in a group within an agency that gets read in on a classified special access program, and then the person sitting next to them isn't. So you have compartmentalization to such a degree where you have these like special access programs within special access programs, and it's ridiculous. The right hand doesn't know what the left hand's doing. But sorry for cutting you off.
No, you're describing what I was just commenting on, that in other words, there is apparently an effort not to release this information, but it seems like the faction that are squelching it have sort of an all-powerful sway that is more powerful than presidents, than leading, figures in the government, that is sort of inexplicable in itself.
Yeah, well, I think what they do is they explain so let's say, I think you're right that the power dynamics are skewed in favor of those who want to cover it up. And whenever like a disclosure-esque person within the military wants to get read in on it, and they want to disclose the information, right? The Empire group, this is the gist I get from some testimony, that they'll read them in on it, but what they'll do is they'll explain all of the possible ways that this could be a disaster, and then they end up converting them, and then the disclosure person ends up converting and becomes somebody who agrees that this should be covered up. And so that's kind of the gist I get. Yeah.
What's your opinion, Ambrose, on, and I think this is a question that a lot of people have, is why would they not just tell us? Is it because of, is it economic? I mean, I would guess that it has something to do with economics and order and things like that, but like, why are they so hesitant and reluctant, if this is actually happening, to clue the rest of the people in?
Yeah, I'm gonna find, there are a bunch of different elements to why the Empire faction does what it does. And I mentioned in the book that I don't blame them. Like, I understand their philosophy. I do. And so I would say the most I would say existential reason is religious instability. That I would put that at the top of the list, because telling people the truth will cause doctrinal turmoil among religious people who are going to be told their doctrines or understanding of history is almost entirely wrong, leading to, existential difficulties of human value. And remember, back in the late 40s, I think 85% of the country identified as Christian. Okay, like the dynamics have changed pretty drastically. But some of the claims from, like, allegedly from the extraterrestrial beings are pretty extreme. But then it's not just religious instability, it's economic instability, political instability, social instability, military defense instability, like just economics. If you start, normalizing, anti-gravity propulsion, there goes the petrodollar, right? Political instability, disclosure inherently leads to globalism, which is a threat to nationalist philosophy. Social instability, you have the 1938 War of the Worlds radio broadcast, which is, a case study on that. But even at the most basic level, military defense instability, it is the job of the Air Force to have a lockdown on our airspace. That's their job, to defend us, right? Well, they can't. They didn't prevent it in the 1967 Malmstrom Air Force Base incident, right? UFO comes, shuts down all 10 of the ICBM warheads. They do the same thing at Echo Flight. They're over in Russia turning them on. So clearly, what would happen if the Air Force went on national television and said, yeah, UFOs are real, they're meddling with our defense capabilities and we can't do anything about it? Nobody wants to say that. So I understand the empire philosophy, I do, but I'm not convinced it's better than the alternative, and so that's why I lean more towards the disclosure element.
What is the alternative?
Disclosing the truth. That people are not crazy when they talk about, seeing UFOs over their house, or, all this kind of stuff. And telling the truth would restore some faith in military institution, which is desperately needed. But yeah, I don't know if it's going to work.
I guess part of the question in telling the truth is that, well, certainly there's things that may have been hidden, but apparently nobody knows the truth. In other words, there is not a comprehension on the part of even the people that apparently are in the know. And apparently there's not even a uniform picture of the implications.
Yeah, so there are different groups. So there are different military figures who are involved in different related projects. And what happens is, this has been going on for decades, where military people will go to like UFO conventions. Colonel Wendell Stevens of the U.S. Air Force would host private conferences at UFO conventions with other military people, like retired, current, and so on. And they would share information of like what projects they were involved in, and so on and so forth. And there are these kind of networks of individuals that do have a lot of information. And so that's how a lot of it has been shared up until this point. And there are, like, for example, Richard Doty talks about this, that there has been DIA working groups that, like, for example, there's one that investigates UFO abductions, where agents of the DIA go out and interview people. Like, the people don't know who they are, but they go out and interview people who claim to have been abducted. And they have been keeping track of this information. And behind the scenes in the military, they are taking it very seriously and are trying to learn more and more. But a lot of the information seems to be locked behind private aerospace companies. And this is where things get tricky when it comes to like documentation, because like Boeing is not subject to FOIA. And so you have all these contractors like Raytheon, EG&G, Lockheed, Northrop Grumman. These are the people that are actually doing the work. And this stuff is so hidden in private industry that it becomes so difficult to get it out into the public. So that's where we're at right now.
Do you think, Ambrose, that someone does in fact know the truth?
I don't think anyone has the full picture, but there's a lot of people who have integral pieces of the puzzle. That's the way I see it anyway.
In other words, like what I'm asking, and I think that your book kind of makes it clear, but in your opinion, does the United States military know that there's extraterrestrial intelligences?
It all depends. I would say, for one, like, you have to be read in on a special access program. You have to have the clearances. Most people don't have that. So the majority of our military is not going to have a clue what's going on. It's only very specific types of people. Like, that's why the Eric Davis notes are so controversial. That just got put into a congressional hearing this, I don't know, a year or so ago, where in I want to say 2002 or 2004, maybe, I forget, the early 2000s, a physicist, a Pentagon physicist, Dr. Eric Davis, had an interview with Admiral Thomas Wilson. And these notes reveal that Tom Wilson, who is J2, Joint Chiefs of Staff, and like top of the DIA, he tried getting access to UFO program. He actually found it. He found UFO programs. Tried getting access. Members of the Watch Committee sat down with him. All they wanted to know was how he found them. That's all they wanted to know. And Wilson was like, I need access. I'm responsible for oversight. And it's like, no, you don't have a need to know. And so they wouldn't let him in. And so he was pissed. And
it's just unreal.
it's unreal, yeah. But this is real. This happened. And so like he essentially found like elements of so-called, majestic 12. And so this is the weeds of our military. This is what's going on.
Yeah. So what are the range, of the different interpretations of the UFO phenomenon?
In the intro to my book, I kind of list some of the major interpretations, which are not mutually exclusive, I might add, but they're, extraterrestrial, obviously, so which means a rational creature whose origins are not from Earth. Intraterrestrial, which means a rational creature who kind of currently lives in a subterranean location on this planet. Interdimensional, which is a rational creature who primarily lives in a different plane or density of reality. Cryptoterrestrial, which kind of refers to a rational creature who lives alongside us, essentially like an elusive, endangered species would. Extratempestrial, which means time travelers. Now, one could kind of further expand this to include a variety of other interpretations. Of course, some believe it's all made up, none of it's real, which you can say it's a kind of government psyop hypothesis to cover up military secrets and crimes against humanity. Others might say it's an occult secret society doing this, like the Freemasons manipulating things behind the scenes somehow. Carl Jung at least initially believed a kind of psychological projection of the human mind hypothesis. One of the proposals from the Theosophists early on was that the UFOs were remnants or descendants from the ancient Atlanteans who came here from Venus. That's one belief. Others speculated that it's kind of a planetary poltergeist. All the Christians basically put no effort into thinking about this. And so the popular view from the evangelical fundamentalists out of California was that it's all just demons, which of course doesn't actually mean anything relevant. So as you can see, there's a great many theories floating around of how to explain all of this.
So Ambrose, your book is called Angels, Archons, and Aliens, an assessment of the theological implications and psychological impact of the close encounters phenomenon. So what is your idea? You kind of put it in a way that crystallized it for me, but can you explain your decision to create the term Omni-God?
Yeah, so the Omni-God was something I had to make out of necessity. So the word God it's simply not good enough to distinguish between ancient henotheistic notions of deity from contemporary monotheistic notions of deity. So when we today talk about we use the word God, we mean a transcendental, bodiless being beyond being who has the omni characteristics which qualify him as divine. Omnipresence, omniscience, omnipotence, eternality, so on. This deity, which, back in the day, Origen, the subsequent Orthodox camp referred to as the Father. This is kind of like the monarchy of the Father concept. The eternal begetter of all things, the generative source. This is what I named Omni-God for convenience. Now, I'll get into why. Like, why the need for this term? So in ancient henotheism, which was standard for pretty much every nation I was able to find, the deity at the top of the pantheon, they didn't see as an omni-God in the way we see it. But it was more like a military general or emperor among little g gods that were stationed on the earth. For example, at the city of Nippur, Enlil, also called Elul, was the patron deity of that city. At the city of Eridu, it was Enki. In where we learn about the Sumerian man that we now know as Abraham, the patron deity of that city was the moon god Nanar, also called Nana or Sin, who was the son of Enlil. In Babylon, the national deity was Marduk. In Assyria, it was Ashur. However, all of these places were filled with polytheists. Exclusive devotion to a nation's patron deity was not, according to my research, an indication of monotheism in the sense that we think of monotheism. Enlil, Marduk, Ashur, they all have divine fathers, according to the literature, such as like the Enuma Elish. They're not unbegotten. Many scholars would say that historically, Yahweh also fits into this category. So according to texts like Deuteronomy 32, 8, and 9, at least in Dead Sea Scrolls 4Q37 and Septuagint manuscripts 848 and 106c, which lists him as a son of the Most High God, Elyon, who was then given to Israel as a patron deity. So to make it crystal clear about identifying who we mean by God in relation to any historical investigations, the term omni-God is helpful to prevent anachronisms when the description of an ancient deity clearly does not reflect modern sensibilities about what divine characters are supposed to look like. So that's why I made that.
So yeah, maybe there. I like your explanation there. That I guess there's two ways of reading this history. You know, say I'm familiar with in Japan. Two alternative interpretations in regard to henotheism, and that is what evolved or what devolved from what. That there seems clearly to be, though, a break in religion as it is commonly understood, as with henotheism and the notion of a God who's omnipotent and not one of a party of gods or the supreme being of the gods. So I guess you could either picture that as henotheism as a de-evolution from an originary belief, or the arrival at an omnipotent God, the Omni-God, the God that is transcendent, is in fact an event that is itself progressive and evolutionary.
Yeah, this is like a very complicated subject because there's so many directions you can take with it. And like I'm certainly not claiming I have this figured out. I'm trying my best, but the way I kind of see it is it seems to be that this is kind of the way I put it in the book. It seems to be that there's kind of nationalists at the top of the political the political elite of any kind of ancient city. You have kind of the kings, the rulers, their staff or whatever. They want primarily like military victory. They want a supreme nation. Like their concerns are about ruling. But then you have like the common folk, the peasants, who would like rain to have their crops grow. They want, they want a lasting marriage. They want food. So they would be like the more polytheistic people who really like we'll pray to whatever God that works, right, for our needs. And so you have this kind of distinction within any particular culture or city. That's kind of the impression that I get when I'm reading this material. But yeah, it's because clearly things get popular in different ages. We could say, like clearly in the West, something changed, and now most people have a monotheistic perspective of God. But then you have in like the East, let's say in India, you have an idea of, like, you could kind of call it a mystical monotheism, where the distinctions are really just avatars of one being, right? You have this kind of the avatar concept, which it may be the case even in the Mesopotamian literature, where, for instance, I think it was either in Babylon or Assyria, the Enuma Elish was rewritten to where the main character, the hero of the story, changes from Enlil to Marduk and then to Asher. And then the people kind of had this concept that, okay, so this other god here is just is an avatar of Enlil. And so it seems to be the case that was at least one view. So it's a mixed bag, and that's part of the problem.
In Japan, it's, Amaterasu is the sun goddess.
Yeah.
And of course, the emperor is thought to be the child of the sun goddess. And so that then has been taken up in state Shinto, so that there's a kind of, as you're describing it, there's a very close tie between the religion, the government, kind of a nationalism, and then there's a kind of break in the actual practice of the religion as you have it, so that you have on the part of the government and state Shinto the attempt to bring about a uniformity that is actually not there in the popular religion. I guess the thing, and maybe my descriptions, of henotheism as either being evolutionary or de-evolutionary, if we take an Origenist or a Maxian interpretation of Christ as being the center of history, that here then is the clear departure toward an understanding of God as we have him. In other words, now we understand Yahweh as who he is in Christ, that here is the final and full revelation of God. And so that we might read this history neither as evolutionary or de-evolutionary, if we understand, well, actually the reality then is in Christ, and this is the center of our interpretation. And so too, with our understanding then of religion per se, how that religion functions, what religion even is. Religion is a word we all imagine that we think it means something, but of course it is such a vague term that it really just references cultures and understandings and worldviews that the religion is a sort of support of. So I guess that would be the place that I ultimately land in understanding even the history of religions, is that the final and full revelation is truly through Christ.
And let me just add to that, Paul, that to me, what Ambrose is describing fits in quite nicely with, say, David Bentley Hart's vision of St. Paul's, cosmology and eschatology and things like that, where, what you described is that you have these different nations with their political, gods and all this other stuff. But that for David Bentley Hart, he's saying that this is like the most important facet for St. Paul of the gospel, is that these gods, whatever they may be, whoever they may be, have been dethroned by our Lord Jesus Christ, right? That through his incarnation, his death, his resurrection, that all things are being ordered under, his lordship, etc. So to me, it kind of might sort of help us to understand, what St. Paul's gospel, as you point out in other places, can be kind of an ambiguous term depending upon the context, whether it's in Galatians or whether it's wherever else, but in other words, that these gods have been dethroned. But whenever I read your book, and we talked about this offline, I just couldn't help but to sense almost a bit of like an existential crisis, nonetheless. You know what I mean? That when you're confronted with this, on the one hand, you have like the beauty of the Christian tradition, the gospel, the hope that we share, things like that. On the other hand, you kind of get all the stuff that you're doing in your book, where you're kind of deconstructing some of the text and what, we don't have to get into this now, but what, might the implications of the Elohim plural be in the, in the Old Testament and things like that. And it really gets super complicated. And I do think that in your book, it does a good job of kind of laying this out, that this isn't as simple as maybe we imagine it to be. It's actually extraordinarily complicated, especially whenever you figure in things like, I think it's really cool in an allegorical sense that Abraham, the national deity of was called Sin, for instance, or whatever. That's like a really amazing potential allegorical sort of gold mine, you know what I mean? But nonetheless, like I did kind of, there was like this angst or something that was being provoked after I read your book. And I'm wondering if you dealt with any of that same sort of existential crisis that may have been provoked in you, and how it's affected you as you were getting into this as a Christian.
Yeah. I first want to deconstruct what existential crisis even means, because sometimes we forget the underlying mechanics of the words that we use. I would define an existential crisis as being when there's a conflicting deconstructive dissonance between what one learns to be true relative to what one already believes to be true. Anything paradigm shifting is going to cause some level of existential crisis, and the extent of the crisis felt is contingent upon the level of dogmatic zeal within the previously established belief. So like, now that we've established kind of my definition, I would say, yeah, I experienced an existential crisis with this subject. But I have to add, like I have consistently with the subject of Christian history or theology. I need to point this out because some people are going to be like, oh my God, he had an existential crisis, everyone. Abort, never learn anything new about UFOs or anything like that. So I need to emphasize that this is a very normal process that any honest person will experience if they desire to learn anything new about the world around them. There are some children out there who have had their first existential crisis when they realize that Santa Claus isn't actually coming down their chimney to give them presents. And their parents seem to have a curious milk mustache or, cookie crumbs around their lips. But here we have a paradigm shift, which may cause an existential crisis in youth. Again, depending on how zealously they believe something, which happens to also be incorrect. Now, I grew up being told that I needed to zealously believe in young earth creationism, a flat view of the Bible, a literal cosmic torture chamber called hell, and so on. I've been in existential crisis for the past 30 years. So this subject is not a new experience for me, but the same old problem of zealous ignorance. So the older I get, the less zealous I generally become about certain things like history or metaphysics, because I've been zealously wrong too many times to count at this point. Is Matt, did Matt leave?
Are you okay, Matt?
Sorry, my dog gets very excited when we talk about UFOs and things like that. So she's going crazy. So I'm trying to shut the blinds down and stuff because she's barking and going crazy. She's having her own existential crisis apparently right now.
I think we
Yeah.
could all sympathize, Ambrose. Yeah, that I think we've all been through a similar existential crisis.
Yeah. Like I said, I think any honest person would experience that. The only way to not have one is to never learn anything new, to always believe you're right about everything.
How is it affecting you? Forgive the dog. Like I said, she's
We're
very
not
excited
hearing
about
the dog, Matt.
Oh, okay.
We're not
Yeah,
hearing-
I'm definitely hearing her. But she's very excited about UFOs and extraterrestrials. But how is all this affecting you now? You know, especially in regard to your Christian faith and what does all this might mean for theology, for Christian theology?
Yeah, so not much has changed, mainly because a lot of the claims have not been formally verified to the public. That's precisely the battleground. That's the crux of the issue. Nobody has all the answers, and we're all on an arduous journey to synthesize the correct information correctly. And I have within me a deep desire to learn and to be informed. And I also like the intellectual challenge of discovery. But I am always incredibly frustrated when I have to, after much effort, admit that I don't have all the answers. And it's a very humbling experience, to be sure. But I'm learning to accept the fact that not all mystery can be uncovered. Some mysteries can definitely be uncovered. And I think many people are too quick to call something a mystery as a kind of justification for not having any curiosity for discovery. That's not at all what I mean. And those people definitely frustrate me. But what I mean is, after years of research, I am very confident that there has been, for example, an official UFO cover-up by the US government to get the public believing that there's nothing to any of this and it's all prosaic. All of the data I was able to find points to this position being true. However, there is so much revealing information that is still classified and hidden in private aerospace companies, or destroyed, like in the case of much of the MK Ultra documents. And thus, we remain in a state, kind of a limbo state of mystery until new revelations can be made by some inside leaker or formal disclosure effort or whatever. This feeling of being presently stuck in mystery when everything inside you wants to move forward is what I'm talking about slowly learning to accept, to build within myself more patience and endurance.
It's interesting. You use the example of Santa Claus. And I think that some of the people in when they're referring to UFOs or these encounters, they actually use the term Santa Claus, right?
Yeah.
That is kind of interesting. Which was actually my first existential crisis, that I was a thorough believer in Santa Claus. And of course, what one wants to do is confirm the reality of this thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so as a child, I was about 4 or 5. We lived at this point in Arizona. And we set off, me and a friend. I actually convinced a friend that I thought we could probably make it to the North Pole and meet the man himself and get this thing over once and for all.
Yeah, a logical thought.
I'm curious, with the UFO phenomena. I think there is that impetus. If this thing, is real, well, I'd like to take a ride in one of these things. I'd like to meet these folks. In other words, the impetus may be the same, and it is purely logical to invest in uncovering this kind of mystery.
Mhm.
And in some way, fitting it into our understanding. And I guess that's the final question we have for you here. That the mystery poses itself with, it gives us several possibilities, theological possibilities, setting aside how we might interpret it.
Yeah.
But what are the range of theological possibilities posed? And in fact, are there contradictory possibilities that are posed?
So I would say even if a small percentage of the assertions in my book are true, then it may have a profound impact on Christian theology. Knowing what is popular belief currently. For instance, most Christians believe that the benevolent, what I call Omni-God, created all things visible and invisible. Right? That's in the Nicene Creed. Well, that's not actually true in a literal sense, because, like, for example, like, God didn't create my son's Lego truck. Okay, he did. Now I know someone out there might be like, but God made your son, and your son made the Lego truck, and therefore God made it. Like, no, that would just mean God makes everything we make, including evil. So there are things that God did not make. And I go over the more mystical understanding of creation, like that, like it's like more along the lines of like Maximus the Confessor. And but I do feel the need to remind people that humans are not the only intelligent class of being that creates things. The angels, archons, aliens, Elohim, Anuna, whatever you want to call the higher life forms, are also able to create things at a scale that we can't comprehend. So we don't exactly know what visible or invisible things were actually made by them. And so the more sophisticated type of Christians, let's say like the more educated, may not really care about any of the revelations because they're usually flexible and don't have a maximalist view of the Bible or tradition. And other religions, much like the indigenous Native Americans or the South American Maya, already believe that they came from star people. So it's not even a new idea for them. And this is why it's uniquely deconstructive for Christians more so than other religions. Not because it's a demonic conspiracy against Christians, but because Christianity has simply developed in a lot of ignorant and bigoted ways. For instance, Giordano Bruno was killed by the old guardians of status quo in AD 1600 because he believed there were exoplanets. That was the principal reason for his execution, according to Dr. Alberto Martinez. In 1550, the reformer Philip Melanchthon wrote against Nicholas Copernicus, saying that heliocentrism is basically a slippery slope to denying what was believed to be a fundamentally geocentric gospel. Christ can't be going around dying on different planets, he reasoned to himself. If a 16th century Hindu guy comes along and is like, actually, we always believed there were other planets out there like ours, I'm sure the Reformed fundamentalists back then would have been like, see, clearly heliocentrism is a demonic conspiracy meant to overthrow Christians specifically. To me, it's paranoid nonsense that doesn't hold up to scrutiny. I mean, clearly something is broken here in the kind of Christian consciousness. The more rigid Christian or Muslim fundamentalists will surely view anything contrary to their own belief as spiritual warfare from the demons and jinn, designed to torment them specifically because they are, according to what they tell themselves, well, I don't know, maybe standing shirtless in the mirror. They're the last bastion of faith on this God-forsaken planet. There's people who genuinely believe that. And I don't think I need to remind any of you that there's a fundamentalist found in every corner of this country. And in my experience, they kind of represent the majority of those on the lower education end of the demographic. So yeah, I mean, that gets back to like why cover it up, right? But I wanted to and in the final chapter of my book, like I mentioned, I do go over the various Christian interpretations thus far, and kind of poke holes into a lot of the reasoning that usually gets thrown around, which is it's always either demons or friendly neighbors from another planet that will probably be baptized.
So let me see if I'm so there is a materialist interpretation or a spiritualist interpretation. Is that broadly correct?
Can you go more into what you mean by that?
Well, I'm just trying to figure, okay, what conclusions are people drawing? I'm not saying what should be drawn, but one of the conclusions could be spiritualist. And so in typical fundamentalist, and in fact, I actually had a class, I think it was in graduate school, in which we covered UFOs. And in that class, it was demons. That was pretty much it. But there could be a spiritualist interpretation, and I assume this is also what you're pointing toward, that it could be not malevolent, but in fact angelic. That it could be a kind of positive spiritualism. So that we could bracket that. And actually, the materialist is not completely separate from that. A materialist understanding would, in fact, just say, well, this doesn't pertain to spiritual beings. This pertains to, just other creatures on other planets, that they're, through evolution, that there's all sorts of creatures that have evolved. And I guess one that's kind of in between the two, I'll add a third one, a kind of spiritualist, materialist understanding, is that some might imagine, well, no, actually what we need to do is broaden out and reinterpret what we mean by spiritual. By spiritual, we often have the notion of a kind of disembodied, figure. Whereas what may in fact be spiritual is in fact a materialist presentation of what we're taking to be or what is often taken to be an angelic being. Would that be the three broad ways of interpreting?
So I would say the first two kind of assumes a certain metaphysical paradigm, a very dualistic one. And then the third one you mentioned is the critique of that paradigm. And so I kind of talk about the third one in my book, I think it's in the exometaphysics chapter, where that's the central question is, what do we even mean by spirit? What do we mean by matter? We don't even really know what matter is. And in the it all depends on like the kind of metaphysical paradigm you're dealing with. And so, like, for example, I talk about one of these early figures, Dr. Newton Meade Layne, who was a parapsychologist in the 40s, who was basically one of the first, probably the first major figure to come up with what is now known as the quote unquote interdimensional hypothesis, that there's multiple dimensions, like the UFOs are phasing into our reality from a different dimension. He called them the Etherians. He basically believed that the UFOs were coming into Earth's atmosphere, phasing in originally from either the etheric planes of Venus or Mars. So he had a very sophisticated understanding back in the 40s that even people today still don't comprehend. They think that just because something is interdimensional, it means it's not extraterrestrial. But Meade Layne already had this notion of multiple layers of dimension from each planet. And that, I wanted to bring that out in the book, because that is, I think, a missing element in the conversation. That if something is true here metaphysically, it's highly probable that it's also true somewhere else. So if there's an etheric plane on Earth, there's probably an etheric plane on Mars, Venus, and the other planets too. And so those two ideas are not mutually exclusive. So like when you get into like a lot of the metaphysics of like the Theosophists, and which kind of became like New Age thought, they see reality on a spectrum of, you could call it, kind of ontological vibration. And this goes back to at the early the turn of the century, like 1900. There's an anonymous work called the Kabbalion. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but the metaphysics of the Kabbalion is actually very relevant to this, where everything is on a spectrum of vibrational densities. So like our physical modality is a condition of this plane, and you can change it theoretically, and then you would phase out of this plane and enter a different one. That doesn't mean you're not physical anymore. It just means you're not physical anymore here. And so it's a much more complicated paradigm, but it does show that there is that third way where the physical and the or you could say the corporeal and incorporeal distinction is really just a matter of modality, like the differences of like ice and water vapor, you know. And so, yeah, that's, I found that interesting.
So that in the end, it is, in other words, as you say, that with material reality is actually one of the most mysterious things there are. That's what we know least about.
Absolutely.
And in science, it's turned out to be not only a mystery, but a mystery with a kind of seeming infinite depth.
Yeah.
That is, there's no bottom
right
to material reality. And so that was, I guess that's kind of there is a kind of mind expanding interpretation that I've taken from this, or potentially taken from it. But of course, it is an interpretive, as Matt and I were talking, with the Copernican revolution. The scientific revolution seems to be that there's only a limited number of interpretations with it because of the solid data that is developing. And I guess that's kind of where we're at with this, that we don't quite know what this is, but there are these potential understandings.
Yep. I agree.
Ambrose, we really appreciate you coming on, man. I know you gotta go.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a great time. Everybody should go out and buy Angels, Archons, and Aliens, an assessment of the theological implications and psychological impact of the close encounters phenomenon. You can get it on Amazon or wherever books are sold, I would reckon. And hopefully, Ambrose, we can get you back on to talk in depth, maybe on some more of this stuff, because it's a conversation that we can definitely continue the depth. And the implications of, it just fosters a really kind of interesting discussion that I'm not sure any of us know exactly quite what to do with it. But it seems to be,
I sure don't.
Yeah. But it seems to be something that definitely could have implications for, all sorts of different, our cosmology, like you said, history, doctrine, as we were talking, offline, I think one could still hold to like a Nicene Christology and all that sort of stuff. And I don't think that it would fit necessarily nicely into a pre-existing Christian paradigm, like all this new information. But I don't think that's what I came in with your book. I was like, okay, I can still, Jesus is still Lord, So any closing, how about for people who might be interested in learning more about this, can you point us in a direction?
Yeah. There's the Weaponized podcast. That's actually a new podcast by investigative journalists out of Nevada, George Knapp and Jeremy Corbell, that they seem to have a lot of connections that have been coming out like pretty consistently, whether it's like new videos that haven't been seen before and stuff. They seem to be pretty deeply connected to insiders. And so I would definitely check them out. And George Knapp has a huge history in the subject going back from like the late 80s. Richard Dolan is a good source for the history aspect of this. I actually for like the indigenous material, I like Montana University professor Dr. Artie Clark, who she's a indigenous Native American woman, and she has two books, Sky People and Encounters with Star People. One of them is dedicated to talking to indigenous Native Americans about UFOs, about like aerial encounters or whatever. And then the other book is her going into South America and interviewing indigenous Maya people about their beliefs, traditions, all of that. Very, very interesting. This book is also great. Alien Identities by Richard Thompson. This is like so my book is like the comparative with the Christian religion. That book is comparing the UFO stuff with Hinduism, and he's He does a great job. So yeah, it's just there's some interesting material for you.
Yeah, the other thing I did, you can use the terrifying Chat GTP, app, and you can just ask it. You can say, what are the
Did we lose Matt?
Matt, you're frozen on us. I don't know. Maybe his dog bit the.
Whoops.
Let's see. I don't know if he's coming back or not. Hey, it's been a fun conversation, Ambrose. I'm so glad we could do it.
Yeah.
Matt's been. I have been reading at your book. It is a long read.
Yeah, it is.
So I didn't get it all done.
Yeah, I don't blame you.
But I'll keep working at it. So
Sure.
but I guess we've lost Matt. So
All right.
all right. Well, so nice to
Paul.
meet you.
Nice to meet you too. Have a great rest of your day.
All right, you too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.